Hello and welcome to Recharge and Rise. I'm Emma Draycott, your host and founder of this event, and I am an anxiety and burnout therapist and hypnotherapist. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Diante, who is a clinical psychologist turned international anxiety coach. So she is actually the founder of the Ease anxiety podcast, and also has her own ease method. And she really transforms the idea of anxiety being a nuisance and a burden to it being your greatest gift. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's super exciting to be on this event with you. Yeah.
Amazing. So I would love, first of all, to ask you what led you to being here and doing the work that you do?
Ooh, big story. So, I've always wanted to be a psychologist. So, obviously, I've always wanted to help people in some capacity. And then when I started out my career around 15 years ago, I would land up with lots of anxiety clients. And I felt so frustrated because there was just nothing that I could do. I would say about a quarter of the people would come in, they'd have some therapy, and absolutely they'd be good to go. But the vast majority of my anxiety clients just stayed stuck. And so, no matter how many textbook strategies I threw at them, no matter how many of the traditional talk therapy approaches I used, they would keep coming back and they'd still be anxious. And so, eventually, I landed up referring those clients to other people that I thought had better expertise to work with anxiety than I did. And then around 2014, so it was probably about 3 years into the practice, my husband landed up getting severe anxiety and he was stuck with, believing that he had a rare lung disease and that he was dying. And the guy was super healthy. So there was no ways that that was happening for him. And I knew that it was anxiety. I knew that he was having panic attacks, but he just stayed so stuck. And so we struggled with that for around 18 months. And it was just such a devastating journey for him. Ironically, I was participating in that, in keeping him stuck, but I only really saw that after the fact. And it was really interesting to watch that in comparison to an anxiety episode that I'd had earlier on, where I'd become really stuck with anxiety. I was afraid to kind of leave the house alone. I didn't want to see new clients because they were new people to me. And as a result, as you can imagine, it wasn't boding well for a private practice. So I went and saw my own therapist and I cycled through that pretty quickly, much like a quarter of my clients had with me originally. So I became really interested in understanding what is the difference between some people who just kind of cycle out of anxiety real quick, while others of us really stay quite stuck with that. And that's where I began to identify that there is this missing piece that most people don't learn at college or in their master's degrees, or they're not in textbooks, understanding that there's this element that creates stuck anxiety. So that's kind of how I got here and became really interested in this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, but also sharing that people aren't, there isn't a flaw within us really, or within people that haven't managed to move out of anxiety. Like that isn't a flaw, because actually there's an element of it that isn't necessarily supported in traditional methods, is what you're saying. So I'd love to talk a bit more about that. And I know you talk about it as being stuck anxiety. So
Yeah.
please tell me what that means.
Yeah. So I guess what happens is that when anxiety kind of escalates into the space where it's so loud, it's so intrusive, it's almost become, the only thing that you can see, or at least it's infiltrating most of what you do every day, then most people go to a doctor because they've got all these physical symptoms, they don't really know how to manage it, and the doctor goes, "Oh, you have anxiety." And this is this big, scary label, diagnosis, disorder that gets kind of lumped on you. And the vast majority of people leave that session kind of feeling quite defeated or debilitated, because now it's like, oh, there is something wrong with me. Whereas anxiety really is just an ordinary emotional response. So for us to label it as something that's wrong starts a war that we can never win, because we're now trying to war against a really pivotal part of our existence, the thing that keeps us safe, that keeps us alive, right? And that then begins this big cycle of what I call stuck anxiety. It's when people become afraid of being anxious. And that fear of anxiety generates more anxiety. So it just becomes this ever perpetuating loop. I call it the anxiety trap, right? But the diagnosis or the disorder that they've been labeled with is really this element of, I'm unable to get out of this. I'm afraid of being anxious. And so the more anxious I feel, the more symptoms I experience, and then the more debilitated I feel. So, from a clinical psychology perspective, we're taught to diagnose these disorders. I always put it in inverted commas because I hate it, right? I just don't believe in disorders at all. But we're trained to diagnose these things. And the way that we do that is we basically look at the symptoms that people are experiencing. And if you're experiencing these symptoms, which are the symptoms of ordinary anxiety, and it's affecting your functioning, then we class you with a diagnosis, right? Or a disorder. Whereas inevitably, most people will struggle with episodes of anxiety in their life because that's life. And this is an ordinary emotional response. It's just what we're doing with that, whether it becomes debilitating or whether we can cycle through it. And it's that doing with it that gets us stuck. So I will always use stuck anxiety to rather talk about these anxiety disorders that people get labeled with.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. And thank you for sharing that, because one, I do believe that, yeah, anxiety is an emotion, it is normal, and it's a normal human response. And with labels, they don't ever get taken back, really, do they? So I also see that there's an identification with anxiety, like it is part of you.
Yeah.
But really interestingly, we wouldn't go and get diagnosed with anger. But anger and anxiety, they're both emotions, right? So we know that we experience anxiety, anger as well, but we wouldn't necessarily identify in the same way. And I wonder if that also, contributes to the stuckness of somebody in
Oh,
anxiety.
absolutely. And this is something that I talk about in my book as well, but it's about the fact that with some of these diagnoses or disorders, we have a separate name. So if you're feeling really sad for a long period of time and it starts to affect your functioning, then you go and then you get a completely different name called depression. You don't get diagnosed with sadness, you get depression. And if you've got anger that is kind of exploding all over the place and it's interrupting your relationships, you might get diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder, right? Because that's about these sort of anger outbursts. So again, it's a different name that's being given to that stuck piece, whereas anxiety
Mm.
doesn't get a different name. So it's really hard for us in terms of our experience and the way that we classify it to see stuck anxiety or this anxiety disorder as a completely different experience to the ordinary emotion, which now means we land up demonizing anxiety as a whole, right? Like anytime you're anxious, this is bad, you have anxiety. We don't think that way of sadness or anger or grief or excitement. We don't think of any of those emotions in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk to, I know you talk about anxiety being a positive experience and emotion and it being helpful for us. So can you talk a bit more to that?
Yeah, and most people really resist this idea, right? Because it is such a physical response. So in no ways am I trying to belittle or demean the experience that people are having because I know that it disrupts lives, for sure it does.
Mm.
But if we think about what anxiety is at its core, it's just an alarm, right? Like that's it. It's the most basic alarm system that we have in our bodies, and it's designed to get you to pay attention. That's the beginning and the end of it. It doesn't have any sort of rational, abstract, logical processes that it follows to identify whether the thing it thinks is a threat is really a threat. It just goes threat, alarm, and there we have it. So if we're thinking about how it's useful just on our daily basis, it's the thing that gets you up in the morning and to work when you would really rather press snooze and stay in bed, right? Because there's a piece of us that's a little anxious that we might lose our jobs if we don't perform well enough. Or it's the piece that kind of gets that mum up in the middle of the night to go and attend to her crying baby because there's that anxiety that goes, there's a threat, we have to pay attention. So we can extend that and say, if you have a work meeting with your employer, for example, and then the night before you start to feel anxious, well, that's a good thing because that means you're going to pay attention to, do you have a clean outfit to wear the next day? Do you know how to get there? Do you know where you're going to park? Do you know the agenda for the meeting? Whereas if you didn't feel any of that, you'd probably just Netflix and chill the whole night and then last minute try to figure that out the next day. So anxiety really is very useful. it's when it becomes really debilitating, it's that stuck anxiety, right? Now it's just asking you to pay attention to itself because the alarm is now ringing about the alarm. So it kind of sees itself, like it sees the symptoms, or it sees the fact that you're feeling a little out of sorts, like you can't concentrate properly, or you're afraid that you might pass out, or you might do something silly because of your anxiety. And so the anxiety itself becomes the threat that anxiety is asking you to pay attention to. And that's where that gets a bit stuck. So the way that we want to look at this is identify that before it became stuck, before we became looping in that anxiety trap, there was something that that anxiety was asking you to pay attention to. And maybe not sort of the low level day-to-day stuff. Maybe there was something else. Maybe there was an experience that was really kind of colliding with your own core beliefs or your own values, or potentially you were avoiding something like a big conversation or making a really important decision because you believe that you can't make that decision. So I always say there's these four reasons for anxiety showing up, right? The first is, and most commonly, that there is something happening in your life that's triggering a core belief. And those core beliefs are ones that we form from our early childhood about ourselves, how we function in the world. And so if something in our daily life collides with that, then our anxiety is going to come up because we feel vulnerable. The other reason is that maybe there's a past trauma that's been triggered in your current life. The third reason is that you're avoiding something, and this is also pretty common. And often the thing that we're avoiding can be our own internal, processes, our own emotions. Maybe there's some grief sitting there that you just don't want to go near, so you put it away, and now we've got some anxiety coming up, or there's a real personal need that you have for some time alone or some freedom, or to get away from this toxic relationship, but at the same time you feel stuck there and you can't move, and so you just avoid making that choice. Well, anxiety is going to come up because it needs you to pay attention to that, right? And then the fourth reason, which is also pretty common, is when we are stretched thin. So when our system is stretched, it can either be sort of physical, mental, or emotional, and we're just not paying attention to that. And that's where, most people might end up in the realms of burnout. If they don't pay attention to it, then the anxiety really screams out. So
Yeah.
always it's asking you to pay attention to something that is not serving you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for going through those examples, because I think that'll be really insightful for people in particular, like that. And often I hear people say, like, it feels like it's come out of the blue, especially when I'm working with panic, like it's just random, but it isn't usually random.
No.
There is an accumulation, but are we listening? And actually, like you've just said, anxiety absolutely will get louder. Like the alarm will get louder if you're not listening to what it's telling you is the threat. And sometimes we can be so disconnected from ourselves that we're not listening to the little sirens going off that actually now it's screaming.
Yeah.
So in terms of stuck anxiety, could you talk a little bit about that cycle? So when the anxiety becomes about the anxiety, how that can perpetuate, and then can we start to talk about how do we get off that cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, panic attacks are probably one of the biggest ones that begin that stuck anxiety cycle. And as you say, I think that those signs and symptoms are always there. Most people I work with will say, I was never anxious before. And then as you start to talk to them a little bit more, you realize, oh, but you always had persistent headaches, or you had lots of tummy aches when you were little, and you're pretty shy. So, these are signs that anxiety is there. And then, of course, it comes out in the big one. And I agree with you, Emma, like panic attacks they're not this isolated event, right? Like it's a buildup of anxiety, which, at the time it's like, oh, I can get you to listen right now, because most people will have a panic attack either when they're driving, or they're on public transport, they're busy watching TV, or they're, in a sleep zone, which interestingly is when you're most relaxed, right? So if we think about it like that, it's not the situation that you're in that's causing the panic. It's the fact that your defenses are down at that moment, and your anxiety goes, oh, she's ready. She's going to listen now. And so it screams at you, which is the panic attack. But now the problem with panic attacks is that they are pretty traumatic, right? In the moment, most people don't really know what's going on for them, particularly that first one. And so there's an element of thinking, there's something really wrong with me and I might die, which then becomes the trauma event that the brain wants you to stay away from in the future. So now it's going to land up wanting to check out to see if there are signs of panic in the future, which is why we become then really hypervigilant about, what am I feeling? Is this another panic attack coming on? And as we begin to focus more and more on those symptoms, and because you are low level anxious that you might get a panic attack, you're going to see symptoms of anxiety. And when you see them, then you fear that you might have a panic attack. And so it builds that anxiety. And eventually we'll end up panicking that we're panicking. And so that's that sort of stuck cycle beginning. The more of those panic attacks we have, the more afraid we become of them, because it starts to feel like they're out of control. Most people think it was the bus that caused the panic attack. So if I just stay off the bus, I'll be good to go. And then they have another panic attack in the supermarket, and now it's the supermarket and the bus that causes that. So as these events happen, we'll end up, feeling more and more afraid of the anxiety. It can happen in a different way too. So panic attacks is one way, but health anxiety, for example, is another, where we might have these super big symptoms in our body. That's what happened with my husband. He really struggled to breathe. He had this pain in his chest. And so instead of thinking, oh, I'm anxious, he was looking at that going, oh my God, there's something wrong with me in my body and in my lungs. And so that started the trajectory of going to the doctor to see, what are these symptoms? But he couldn't let it go, right? Because he had convinced himself that there was something wrong with him. So now, as he keeps scrutinizing his body to see more symptoms of this thing that he thinks is wrong with him, the more anxious he feels and the more symptoms he sees. So again, it's a form of anxiety about anxiety. So all the way that this gets stuck, I talk about these sort of 4 phases of stuck anxiety, right? Like the very first space that we find ourselves in is that initial, I'm overwhelmed, I'm afraid of this, I don't know what's going on. And that's the fear response, which then kicks us off into the second stage where we want nothing to do with it. So I talk about this as being the rejection of anxiety. Like, I'm done with this, I'm warring with you, I want you out. And anything that you want to reject, you're kind of afraid of. So that's going to cause more anxiety about anxiety as you try to push that away, right? And as the saying goes, what you resist always persists. So it is just going to get bigger. And the more you're fighting with that, the more you're going to want to know, is it going away? Which leads us into that third phase where we're perpetually checking to see how anxious we are. Maybe we're waking up in the morning checking, oh, am I anxious this morning? How anxious is it? Can I rate my anxiety? We have like our smartwatches on where we can check our heart rate. Some people track their sleep. So there's this perpetual wanting to see, how is the anxiety doing? Is it going to, infiltrate my day too much today? And of course, again, what you pay attention to is going to become your experience. So if we're perpetually paying attention to anxiety, we're going to be perpetually experiencing it, which then grows that feeling of overwhelm, right? And eventually people land up in the fourth phase where they stop doing things because of their anxiety. They don't want the anxiety to get worse. So they stop going to the supermarket, getting on that bus, going out with friends, saying yes to events, traveling. I mean, you know it, right? And the more that they say no, the more they confirm that this anxiety is a dangerous thing and they can't cope with it, which then makes it even more overwhelming. And we go back into that cycle. So that's how it kind of goes round and gets us trapped.
Yeah, definitely. And when you was talking about like the symptoms tracking, and we just want to be open and honest with this, and you have from what you've learned yourself in terms of practice, but you go to a self-help guide around anxiety, it's very likely to tell you to track your symptoms. But what we know to be true, and I know you've literally just said this, so I feel like I can talk with both of us, it's not helpful. No. Because you're then focusing on a symptom that is then causing you more anxiety and you're more attuned to, and then there's the fear response to that. So some of the traditional strategies that have been taught academically and that you can get access to within self-help actually feed the cycle, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would say almost all of the coping strategies that we're given actually land up feeding the anxiety and making it worse. Yeah. And it's sad because the doctors are suggesting it, the self-help books are suggesting it, and then we continue to stay stuck in the cycle, because really the longer you war with anxiety, the worse it gets. End of story. So those strategies are all there about getting rid of anxiety. Anxiety is not the problem, right?
Yeah, but that's what people think that they need as well, the strategies to get rid of the anxiety. So, what are the other strategies, and how do you know what I've got visualizing and visualizing that? Is it a fly trap or something that you put on your fingers, and actually the more you resist it, like the more you
Yeah.
get stuck. So actually you have to kind of lean into it and out, and that's what I was thinking about when we're talking about strategies, or thinking about strategies that actually help us to get out of anxiety. So what's more useful? What have you found for your clients? You've worked with many people experiencing anxiety. What's been the most effective strategies to use for them?
Nothing. So before you take a big deep breath, really, nothing works, and not nothing works, but doing nothing works. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. But then people are like, but how do you just do nothing? So of course we need to have some strategies that will help you to do nothing, which is really what it comes down to, right? That kind of, and that I love that it's the Chinese finger trap.
Oh,
It's
that's what
such,
it's called.
yeah, such a good example because it is the more you kind of struggle with it, the more tighter it gets its grip. But it is kind of pushing towards that is the thing that releases it. So yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I help my clients with is really understanding anxiety because we do have this very skewed idea of what it is. We have got to strip this idea that it's a disorder and an illness. So a large portion of the work is around that, and really just understanding how it functions in your brain, what it's there to do, um, as the alarm system that it is. I think it's really important for people to understand why me, why now, as in understand what it was that anxiety was asking you to pay attention to originally. Because if you don't understand what that is, then you're not going to listen. And if you don't listen, the alarm gets louder. So there is something about the listening piece. But what I always say to people is imagine there is somebody at your door, right? And they're knocking frantically. I mean, they're going crazy out there because they believe that they've got a piece of information for you that's going to save your life. They have got to tell you, otherwise, you're going to die. But they're going crazy out there, and you're thinking, this person is pretty volatile. I'm not letting them anywhere near my house. So I'm just going to pretend I'm not here. I'm going to lock the door, hide away, maybe even, call the cops on them. But they know you're there and they know they can save your life with this information. So, like, they're not going to go away, right? They're just going to get more and more and more frantic until you open the door. And that's the process of listening is like, how do we open the door to our anxiety to let it in? And for sure, when you let it in the first time, it's going to be really frantic because it's got so much to tell you because you weren't listening. And then as you listen, it starts to calm down and tell you the story a little bit more calmly. So the strategies for learning how to do that really include kind of being able to tolerate that feeling of discomfort. A large portion of people that I work with just haven't been able to learn how to sit with their feelings because we grow up in societies that say, big feelings are unacceptable. You got to put that away, put your big girl panties on, soldier on, don't show people what to do, what you're feeling. Parents don't know how to manage their kids' emotions, so they're teaching them that from a really young age. So when you get into these big feelings, it's really uncomfortable, and of course, you just want to get it away. So, a strategy that's going to help you just sit with that and feel it and notice it without then also diving into it and paying too much attention to it. There's this really careful balance that we've got to attain, right? And then, of course, there is the mindfulness aspect of this is like, how do we get present to our daily moment right here, right now? Because let's face it, anxiety isn't about what's happening right now. It's rarely that. If it is about that, then you probably should pay attention and do something, right, to keep yourself safe. But 9 out of 10 times, it's about something that we hope is not going to happen in the future. But here, that thing isn't happening yet. So, how do we get present to what is currently happening and continue to focus our attention on that? Because if we can do that, then we're not focusing on the anxiety so much and you actually get back to living. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting that presence, because of right now in this moment, because so much of the fear, worry, and anxiety is about something else outside of this very, very moment, isn't it? So that's really interesting. I'd love to. I lost my train of thought. We were talking about brain fog before, wasn't we?
Yeah.
But we've covered a lot of those things. So, in terms of the fear of the fear,
Yeah.
can we talk about that a little bit more in terms of It's actually about the letting it in and feeling it. So that is something that people are potentially quite afraid of, actually
Yeah.
feeling those experiences of anxiety. And I know, especially when I work with panic, that the concept of what I know to be true about how to move through an episode of panic is people really resist that. And I'm wondering if you find that as well, because actually you might have a different technique, but what I'm asking them to do is something very different to what they are used to doing. Because actually, if they resist it, it literally gets bigger because they're creating the fear around the panic. So panic increases. And I wondered what your experience is in managing that and how you help people to reduce their fear of the fear itself.
Yeah, it is such a big topic because unless we can
Yeah.
reduce the fear of the fear, it's just going to self-perpetuate, right? And it's so true what you're saying because the brain and your anxiety really is just trying to keep you safe. So if it's created this idea that that supermarket is the thing that causes panic and panic can kill you, then it doesn't want you to go anywhere near the supermarket. So what it does is it then sends all these signals because it knows if we throw out this heightened anxiety at her, then she won't go into the supermarket and we'll all stay safe. That's what it wants to do, right? And so when you listen and you give in to what it's saying, then you're just reinforcing that that's the best way to keep you out of the supermarket. But we all know that there's nothing unsafe inside the supermarket. The only unsafe thing is having the panic attack, which you're only having because you're afraid of having one, right? So, yeah, it gets caught up in its cycle. The thing that stops most people from engaging with what some might call exposure therapy, because I think a lot of therapists do this thing where they say you just got to push through, you just got to go there and you got to prove to yourself and anxiety that there's nothing going to happen. And that can be re-traumatizing in some instances because if people push themselves and then they land up having another panic attack, they're kind of proving to themselves that they were right and the therapist was wrong, right? So it can be a bit counterproductive. It is important for us to really identify what the blocking beliefs are to the acceptance of anxiety. Again, your brain does want nothing else but your survival and your safety. That's it. That's why it's doing all of these things, right? So it's never going to accept something that it believes is a threat to your survival. And if anxiety or panic remains a threat to your survival, you're not going to accept it. No matter how many strategies you put in place, no matter how many meditations, how much being in the present you're practicing, if you're believing that, it's not going to go away. So there's these four blocking beliefs, right? The one is that anxiety or panic attacks can kill us or harm us. And so a lot of people feel like that racing heart or the palpitations will then end up in a heart attack or something fatal. And so as a result, they don't want to go anywhere near it. They can tolerate and possibly be with lowered levels of anxiety. But if it escalates beyond a certain point, then that's where they say, that's it, I'm going to die. And I can't go there, right? The second blocking belief is that anxiety is going to make us go crazy. You know, that thing of like, if it gets real bad, I'm going to start doing stuff that is out of my control, really embarrassing. Someone's going to land up sedating me, wrapping me up in a straitjacket, taking me to the nearest psychiatric hospital, and that'll be me forever. Even the sort of depersonalization, that sort of symptom of anxiety can cause that fear. So again, we're not going to let anxiety run its course if we believe we're going to go crazy. The third blocking belief is that we fear that anxiety is going to render us useless. So either I'm going to pass out and then I won't be able to function. I might not be able to talk or get my words out. I'll have that brain fog. I just won't be able to function at work. And so if that's the threat, then again, we're not going to let anxiety get to that point because we don't want to be rendered useless. And the fourth one, which is really interesting, is that anxiety is shameful. And so we don't want people to see this about us because it's really embarrassing. It says something about me. I'm either weak, disordered, and I shouldn't be that way. So then, it's this thing of like, I can have the anxiety at home, but I cannot have it out in public because people will see that about me. So the way that I work with my clients is to try to identify which is the blocking belief that they're holding. And then can we begin to challenge that? Because as you know, our entire reality is filtered through what we believe. Yeah. So we only experience reality through what we believe is true of reality. So if we believe that anxiety is fatal, then we're only going to take up the information that proves that to ourselves. So anytime that we have real big symptoms, we're going to say, you see, this is really serious. But if we paid attention to some of the other evidence that is against that belief, you'd start to see that there's a whole lot more evidence for the fact that anxiety is actually very safe. Yet we just discount it, right? And it's true because think about it, most of us hold a belief that we're not good enough, right? On some level. And so when somebody comes up to you and says, wow, you're such an amazing person, like I love being with you, we're like, oh, and then later on we go, yeah, but they were just saying that because they wanted to make us feel better. Or, we somehow manage to just dismiss that because that evidence doesn't meet with what the core belief is. So similarly, we're not going to take up the evidence that doesn't align with the belief of anxiety is going to kill me, anxiety is going to make me crazy, unless we actively choose to. So this takes a big decision, a big solid choice to say, okay, I don't want to believe this anymore. Let's have a look at what is true of anxiety. How many cases do we know of someone who's dropped dead of a heart attack in the middle of a panic attack, right? Because of panic. Like, it's rare, if ever. And how many people actually go psychotic in the middle of their anxiety or their panic attack? Again, I've worked in an inpatient unit and I have never seen somebody admitted for psychosis because of anxiety. Absolutely not. So again, if we go back to that core of what anxiety is, an alarm to keep you safe, how can it do any of these harmful things, right? That's like contrary to its very nature. We have to find the evidence for that.
Yeah. And I guess that's the point, isn't it? Like anxiety and experiences of it can feel like the body is, harming itself. I'm just going to put it in that way. There's no other way of putting it. But actually, it's doing very much the opposite. It is actually about your survival. And I've definitely experienced times where it feels like it's attacking my body and therefore I'm unsafe. But actually, when you look at the evidence of what it's doing, so for example, the constriction of, it feels like constriction of the airflow, but it's very, very clever that it's actually making it more productive for your survival, but it doesn't feel that way and it's different to what you normally experience. So yes, in its very nature, it's actually a survival mechanism. It will do everything it can do to make sure that you are actually okay and safe, because that's what it's there for. So I there can see those beliefs and shifting those is really, really helpful to then also get through the resistance of changing the relationship with anxiety, for sure. So wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your ease method, and I'm pretty sure you've talked about it in these concepts, but is there any way that you want to summarize it or talk about it more?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So the ease method really is designed as an antidote to the 4 stages of stuck anxiety. So, as we've spoken about, there's the fear, and then there's the rejection, there's the checking, and then the avoidance. And so ease really takes each one of those and it puts it on its head. So instead of feeling fear and overwhelm, we feel empowered. That's the first E, right? And that's about understanding anxiety, understanding how it functions, answering your why me, why now, getting to the root cause. And then that allows us to move to the A of ease, which is acceptance. And that's moving away from the rejection of anxiety and learning to sit with it, listen to it, forming a better relationship with anxiety, responding in a different way, which then allows us to shift, which is the S of ease, shift our focus off of the anxiety, the symptoms. But, we can say, don't put your hand in the cookie jar, and then the only thing you want to do is put your hand in the cookie jar. So we don't say, don't focus on anxiety, because then all you're going to do is focus on anxiety. So what do we want to shift our focus towards? And that's part of that process, is identifying, what are the aspects of your life that may not be aligned, that are not serving you, and where can we put our attention that's going to help build that as we shift our focus off of anxiety. And then the last E is for engage, which is going to undo the process of avoidance, helping you to kind of take the right steps to get out there and start doing the things that feel frightening. It's the fourth one because you have to actually have the first 3 in place before that becomes a successful endeavor. So I rarely suggest that people just go out and engage or do exposure before they've actually put some of that work in place before.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that, because I know you mentioned exposure earlier, and it is a strategy that many people use. It's a strategy that I use, but at the right time.
Yes.
with the right person, with the right strategies. So what I see is people know it as a strategy, or they've got some concept that I just need to do it and get over it. But what happens is, and what I see is they go totally beyond their tolerance of that situation. So it's not just something that is a little bit anxiety provoking, it's very highly anxiety provoking. And then they might not cope well in that situation because they haven't got the they haven't done the foundation work that you're talking about as well. So it reinforces, they have a bad experience, it reinforces that fear, the traumatic experience of having a panic episode or feeling like they lost control or embarrass themselves and all those things. So it's not good. So it's definitely a strategy that
Yeah.
comes at the right time with the right support, with the right strategies already in place.
Yeah, and I see that all over social media, people who've tried it on their own because they've read something or they've watched a TikTok
Yeah,
video that said they should do it. And big ups to them for being brave enough to try, right?
yeah,
But at the end of the
yeah.
day, I do recommend that people work with a professional like yourself. If they're doing exposure, they need to have that support and the right steps, because you're also not going to suggest that somebody just dumps into the deep end without figuring out how to swim, right? So it's about
That
those
is
strategies
literally
first.
what a great analogy, because that's what it's like going in the
Yeah,
deep end without
yeah,
swimming. And ever so often, I've seen people have successes, and that's great,
yeah.
but it's not the best idea.
No.
Start smaller for sure. Um, I'd like to talk about safety behaviours. Now, you might have a different word for that,
Yeah.
but really want to talk to behaviours that actually are recommended strategies. And you just mentioned about social media, there's so many abundance of things. If you experience anxiety and it's something you search up, you're likely to see lots of like tips and hacks and tricks. But could we talk to the things that actually keep it going round and we know actually really isn't helpful in the long run?
Yeah, 100%. Well, I think social media is probably one of the biggest safety behaviors that are counterproductive. Um, so safety behaviors, yeah, I think we use the same term in the same way. It's really about the thing that you're doing to try to keep yourself safe from anxiety, but in actual fact, it's perpetuating the anxiety. It's providing temporary relief in that moment, but long term, it's actually contributing. And one of the things that most people do when they're feeling anxious is they pick up their phone to scroll. And because, the algorithms are super, super clever. So, you click on one thing and then you're going to have a whole host of other things. But the algorithms also don't really distinguish between what is a professional account versus a layperson account. So, especially I think on platforms like TikTok, you're going to get a whole array of information. And we tend to just believe everything that we see. Very few people will click on a profile to go and see what are the qualifications of this person who's suggesting this. And so you potentially may be picking up ideas that are not well founded in research or evidence based, and potentially don't come with additional support, which is pretty dangerous. The other thing that most people do is they go and link up onto these Facebook support groups. So, anxiety support group or health anxiety support group. And while it's fabulous to know that you're not alone, 100% there is massive value in that. It's also tricky because most people are going on there going, do you experience this symptom? And now, if you weren't experiencing that symptom, you're going to be afraid of having that symptom. And then you're going to start looking for that symptom. And then you're going to start finding that symptom because that's what lands up happening, right? Or they're asking about their medication experiences. And so, again, you're getting 200 comments about various different medications that people have tried, but they're all still from people who are in the same boat as you, which means that even though you're getting that information, you're not trusting it anyway. And now you're just even more confused because you've now seen 3 other medications that you've never even heard of before. So it just fuels that anxiety, right? My recommendation for safety behaviors that have got to do with social media is really try to be a bit more discerning around who it is that you follow. There are fabulous accounts out there. Yours is one of them, Emma. But, we've got to be careful about what we're following. And so kind of unfollow the stuff that you can go and have a look and see there's no registration here, there's no qualification behind this person's name, because there are a lot of people who've been through their own experiences of anxiety and then go, okay, I'll show you what to do, but what works for one person doesn't always work for another. So that's one of the biggest safety behaviors.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I remember when I was first on social media, being totally honest, I did lots of hacks and tips and things like that because it is what people wanted. And I have got hundreds of hacks and tips. I actually remember writing 100. I was like, there's so many things that I can share with you that actually just help with anxiety in the moment. But I stopped sharing that because it isn't that what you need. It's about getting back to the core root of why is anxiety showing up in the first place. And when you get there, and I know you believe in this too, because equally I'm discerning with who I follow in my accounts, and you share some really valuable information because it isn't about trying to put, I say, stick a sticking plaster on it. Yes, you can do techniques that can help in the moment, but you're putting a plaster on it to regulate. But why is that alarm going off in the first place?
Yeah.
So I started to shift the focus because even though it's what people want, I didn't want to contribute to
Yeah.
that because it's not, and it's not the techniques I share are they're so unique to the person,
Yeah.
then because what is right for one person isn't right for the other. And I think if you're just following loads of tips and tricks, have you got other support? And
Yeah.
actually, will you find your way out of that? And I think it's a good question, actually. If you're still experiencing anxiety and you have been following accounts and you don't feel better, it's a really good indication to think, well, there's a missing piece there. Is there
Yeah.
good information? Have you got the right support? Because even if you might know the information, are you able to move through it? So, yeah, that's a really good advice around social media, who you're following. And I've been part of the support groups as a person experiencing
Yeah.
difficulties. And honestly, one of the worst things when I was not in good health myself was worst thing I was part of, to be honest,
Yeah.
because it can be quite draining, lack of hope, yeah, so good
Yeah.
advice.
That's huge. Just to add on to that, the hacks that you were sharing, I think they are fabulous, right? But what happens when people are just kind of over consuming these hacks without really understanding why they work? We often don't implement them properly either. So then when you don't implement it properly, you don't get the results. And so then you have heaps of people walking out going, oh, breathwork doesn't work, or this doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. It does work, it does work. You have to work it in the right way at the right time and for the right purpose. And then it is very effective. But it's so hard, and you know how this is, Emma. It's so hard to share the why of a hack, how to implement it properly, and the hack itself in a 60-second video. So
Mhm.
yeah, it becomes a bit futile. But I think for anyone who has been kind of consuming those hacks and hoping that they'll work, and then feeling a bit despondent and sitting there going, nothing works for me, my anxiety is never going away. It's perpetuating that feeling because nothing's working. But those things do work, right? Like go into Emma's account or follow somebody and then go and ask her for the strategies, because then she can explain them better, and you can get the full Monty of how it works, and then it will work. And
Yeah.
essentially, I think at the core of it, we want to be using any of those hacks not ever to fight or get rid of anxiety, but rather to be with it, to listen to it. Yeah.
The intention.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that, because the intention of why you're doing the thing has a really big difference. And this is something, it's like a tightrope of try and getting the sweet spot of this, because yes, you're doing a technique to reduce your level of anxiety, but you don't, it's not to have the intention to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And that's a sweet spot that is it's a bit
It is
complicated
a bit complicated for sure.
to, isn't it? It's a bit like do this technique to reduce anxiety, but actually we're not trying to get rid of anxiety, we're accepting it too. And this is why I think I know that, and I'm sure you'll see this in the clients that you work with, they've probably done the self-help, they might have had other therapists, as my clients do as well, and there is just something so different. So I'll talk about my own experiences. I'm a mental health expert, I've got experience in that field, and I know all of the things. But I remember when I had an experience myself, so I was involved in a car accident and developed PTSD. Very hard to help yourself on your own through something, even when you know the things. So there is such a difference in knowing the information and then guiding yourself through it.
Yeah.
That takes a lot, doesn't it? And I think just acknowledging that it doesn't make us weak. We all have different ways that we um respond as well. So for me, and most people that I speak to are, I'm such a reflector in talking and that process is really, really important. And sometimes it isn't the information that people are lacking, it's being able to like
Yeah.
apply it to themselves and just have that space. So on that note, I would love for you to share. I know that you've got a free gift for our listeners, so I would love for you to share what gift you've got for them so they can continue the conversation
Yeah.
and the support really.
Amazing. So I am sharing the ultimate guide to anxiety interventions because there is such an array of ways in which you can intervene with your anxiety out there, and it can feel really confusing. Like, what sort of therapies are there? What are the medications? What are the things that people use? So the ultimate guide is really just going to break down what works, what doesn't, and why it doesn't work, and then kind of remind you on what really does work for anxiety so that you can start taking that process.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. And I hope that people will find actually from that it's not massively complicated. There are simplicities in it, but doing so thank you so much for sharing that. Really, really grateful. And of course, your details will be below so that if people want to connect with you, they know exactly how to do that and to learn more about your ease method as well. And then a gentle reminder, so my free gift to you as well is to join me on a 3-day masterclass experience where I will be sharing your freedom formula to anxiety and burnout. I'm very looking forward to that. So you can sign up below. So thank you so much for being here. It's been a beautiful conversation, and thank you as well to our listeners for sharing your energy and your time, but also for the commitment to yourself to experience this conversation with us. So we're very, very grateful. So I'll bring us to an end today. We'll just finish with saying thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Yay.
Yay, bye for now.